Yeah, hi Praveen. Hi Ria. Okay, just quickly set it up. Set me up. Just yeah. Hi Deepak. Hi Jayasri. Yeah, hi Alvaro. Arpit. Hope you guys are doing well. Okay, so let's wait for a few more minutes, then we can start with our session. Okay, so meanwhile, I'm clearly audible, or is there any background noise or not properly audible? Yeah, hi Karthik. Okay, thank you, Lalit. Okay, so let's wait for a minute, then we can start. Yeah, hi Nilima. Fan noise. Can't help it out, bro. But I guess it is, like my voice is much clearer than the fan noise, I guess. So I guess that will work. Yeah. Thank you, Shikhar. Okay. So I guess we can start now. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so hi guys, Rahul this side. Hope you guys are doing well. So this is a 8th session. So, and in this session, we are basically going to talk about like how state management works in React, and maybe create a form, and maybe so look at some event handling. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so in previous few sessions, first we talked about the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Then we covered few things about React and JSX elements, and the components, which is basically a crucial thing in React. Okay, so if you haven't seen the videos, you can go in the description box and find the links. Okay, so like obviously like after this session. Okay, so in this session we are going to cover a few things, which first is event handling, which is I guess the important thing, because whenever you are creating a user interface, so you want a, like if you are creating modern interfaces, if you are just creating a normal interface like blog, just like a user can go through, then it's fine. But if you want to do some actions based on the user events or something like that, event handling is important. And state management, like uh, let's say we have some state, and if we want to change the state based on some user actions or any further thing, so state management is also required. And forms, obviously, like if you want to take input from the users, forms come in handy in that. Okay, so I have not created much of the content for this, the theoretical content, because like this is most probably going to be a complete practical session. So we are going to cover all of these stuff in the code. Okay, so currently, like this is the state of our app which we have created so far. Okay, so this is the app, and the code, like I have put it in a GitHub repository and shared the link, which is in the description box. Okay, so let me zoom it a bit. So I guess that's visible. Okay. So currently, currently our project is fairly simple. It's static, right? There is only one state. We are not having multiple states, or these are like which we are on the screen. The things which we on the screen is just coming from the components, which is static. Okay. So one thing we can do is we can handle some events, and let's say this is the anchor tag, right? And these are some buttons like edit button or delete button, like edit for editing this expense, delete for deleting this expense. So these are all the kind of events that we want to handle, right? So let's start with the the simple event handling process. so that once we get to know about the event handling, they can then we can like move forward with like how these event handling can trigger the state change. Okay, so let's look at the code. So let me zoom it a bit. I guess the code is visible. If the code is not visible, just let me know. Okay. Okay, so this is the folder structure that we have created so far. And in components, like we have the sidebar expense item. Okay, so in sidebar, we have this list, right? Let me quickly close this. And we have the sidebar list. Okay, and we are entering this using the components and list rendering basically, right? So let's say we want to handle a click on this. Let's say we have this expenses. So whenever I click on this, I want to log something. So first of all, like how can we add the event listeners? So first of all, like in HTML, like in all the inbuilt HTML elements like div, UL tag, even the anchor tag buttons, like they have the complete access to the native DOM events basically, and React exposes them so that we can mention some special props. So in React, we don't follow the imperative way. We follow the declarative way. So like in vanilla JavaScript, like if we have to add some event, what we do, we usually do this stuff. Let's say we have this. Okay. Okay. So what we do here? So let me quickly convert into a component. So in JavaScript, we usually do this. Like document dot get element by ID or query selector, then we add the listeners. Okay, so this is the JavaScript way. We don't do this kind of stuff in React. Instead, React gives us some special props that we can use. So it always starts with on. Okay, so as you can see, like if I have written on, so these are the certain events that we can handle, that we can even listen to. Okay, so these are the default, like React exposes basically these events onto the tag so that we can make use of it. So like we have these kind of events which we can listen to. So on blur, on click, there are many kind of events. So it totally depends on your requirement. Okay, so let's say we want to capture the click event. So this is the thing that we do here. Okay, so on click. So this is the prop. This is a special prop, and in this prop we have to pass a function. Okay, so that function is, let's say we are defining an inline function. Okay, so let's do this log and let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, just a second. Yeah. Okay, so if I save this in C, so we have this, right? So I have added a click event listener on these. Let's these are all the list items, right? So the event listener is added to all of the items here. Okay, so if I click on this, so if you can see this, like it is redirecting, so it is clearing a bit faster. So if when I clicked on this, like the click was console, right? So but it is redirecting because we are using the anchor tag here. Okay, so instead of giving this function inline, we can create a function, arrow function we can create. Okay, so usually like whenever you are creating a function, it's a good practice to give name a function like this, like click handler or click handler, or you can even like action item handler. So putting the handler makes it always like it is some sort of handler handling some things, right? And we can provide a parameter which is event. Okay, so let's log it. So instead of giving this function, what we can do, we can just directly give this function as a value to this prop. So why are not we executing this function? So first, let's say we execute it. Okay, we are just executing this function in this here. Okay, so if we see like it is like clicked is logged, already logged. Like if we have not clicked on this, but it is still logged. Why? because like whenever React is compiling up all the things, going through each and every line, so on click, like we have assigned this function, right? So it is executed on the go and the listener is not added. So let's say if we click on this, it's still reloading, and even like there is no log, right? So we have to pass this function as a value. So if you see, let me refresh it. So as you see, like we have these list items, right? So when I click on that, so like there was a log clicked, but it is redirecting. So we can cancel that event by event default. Basically, we are canceling the event. So like this refresh does not occur, because if we are refreshing the page, then the whole concept of single page application is gone in waste. So let me save it. Okay, refresh and let's check. You see, when we click on any of these items, we are logging something, right? Great. So like using this method, we can add the event. We can listen to the events whenever user clicks on something. Okay. So we can add a click listener to any of this. It's totally up to us. Okay. So in previous lecture, we studied about the concept of props, right? So props are what, like whenever we want to communicate from parent to child, we makes use of props. Okay, so that is top to bottom approach. But let's say if a child wants to communicate with parent, how can we do that? Let's take a look. Okay, so like there are three list items, right? So what I want is whenever like this expense list is rendered, I want this to be active. And whenever there is a form, or whenever we are having an expense form, I want this to be active. Whenever I'm having an analytics page, I want this sidebar item to be active. So for that, like whenever click event occurs, what I want is like let's say there is a ID. Let's say these all items have some sort of IDs. Okay, so currently the active ID should be active, right? So what we can do is like we have defined this inbuilt prop here, right, and passed a function there. So what we can do is, okay, so we have this index, right? So what we can do is we can pass a prop here on item click and define a function in there. So let's say we have defined a function as item click handler. Okay, so we are receiving an ID here. Let's log the ID, clicked ID. Okay, so in ID, let's give them a unique ID to all of them. Okay, so we can uniquely identify each of these items. Okay, and we can pass this as a value. We should not execute it, right? Because it will be executed right away. So it won't be, reached to the child component. So, and this is the sidebar list item which we have here, and we are receiving a prop here, right? Which is on item click. You can name it anything you want to. Okay, so on item click. So what we can do is, this is a function, right? This the value here is the function. So what we can do, whenever the click handler occurs, we can call this function and send the ID, because we are receiving the item here, right? So this item has a ID value, key value, right? This ID. So we can send this up, and let's see. We can save this up, or yeah. So we see now. Let's say we did. You can see like the ID logged is 0 because we haven't given it the ID 0, add expense the ID 1, analytics the ID 2, right? So it's working. So like that's like how we implement like bottom to top approach. That's how we can communicate with the parents, right? So let's say in the end, like what I want is this thing should be active, right? So what we can do is we can define a variable here. So in app.js, we are including this sidebar component, right? So let me refactor this code a bit, because like all these components, so let's say we have this, right? Expenses. So expenses means like I want to list all the expenses, and add expense means like I want to render a form here. So I want to change the state. Okay, So what we can do is in app.js, let's define a variable. Let, yeah, let active maybe item is 0 by default. Okay, and let's put all the sidebar list from here to this file. Okay, and we can pass this as the prop, right? Sidebar list, maybe active item. Okay, so now this component is receiving two props, which is sidebar list and active item. Okay, so what we can do is we are rendering this, right? So what we want is like that thing should be active. So we can make it active and pass another prop to the sidebar list item, each and every item. So what we can check the item is item.id. If the active item, like this is the active item, right? So initially this thing should be active, right? So we are giving this by default. And if item equal to item ID, and then we are making it active. So we can go here and we can check for a prop which is active. Okay, and we can give it a class name. So if active is true, I want to dynamically insert a class here which is active. Otherwise, it should be empty. Okay, so let's save and see. Yeah, it's worked just fine, right? Because like initially we have given the active item as 0. Okay, so what we want is like whenever we click on different item, it should be changed. It should at least change. So how should we do that? How can we do that? Okay, so let's first of all let's add the event listeners, all the functions in place. We have another function which is I don't know, item click handler, okay, which is receiving an ID from the sidebar component. Okay, now let's change the active item to ID. So um, item click handler, right? So let's go to the sidebar component, and it is receiving this particular function, right? So let's pass this. You can see like there is a hierarchy, right? The children goes to the parent and the parent goes to its parent. So it's like that. Okay. So we can also omit this particular step, but I'm just going to put it in this way just for the references. Okay. So, okay. So what we are doing here, we are receiving the ID and we are logging it in app.js. Okay. Let's print the ID. So if we see, like in app.js, we have this ID, add expense, which is one analytics. But this variable, which we have declared, the active item, it is being changed, but the state is not changing. Like if the value is reassigned, the expected behavior should be like whenever I click on this, and if the active item is changed, then it should be active, right? But it is not happening. Why? So that's what we need for like the state management. So let's go to the state management and see. Okay, so state is not a React specific concept, but it is a key concept in React which we use. Now we have seen like in this normal variable, when we assign a default value, it is working just fine. But when we are trying to update it, it is not reflecting in our app. Why? Why it is not reflecting? Because React just simply ignores it. It does not give weight to those variables because like it is not managing our state. So for managing the states, where we have some special thing which is a hook in React, which is use state. So all the hooks in React start with use keyword. Okay, So use state, use effect, use, use callback. So these are all the hooks. So we are going to learn about few of them. Okay. So meanwhile, like you can go through the official documentation if you want to know much more about the hooks. Okay. So we are going to make use of use state because this is the prominent hook for managing the states. Okay. So it is used to manage states and functional components. Okay. So as we see, like normal variable does not, let's say if there is some event change, by using the normal variables, the component is not re-rendered. So by making use of use state, we can do that. Okay. So to use the use state, first we have to import it. Okay. How can we import it? By putting the curly braces and importing it from the React library. Okay, so it is provided by the React library. What it does is a useState is just a function which allows us to pass pass a value, define a value which is a state, as a state where like whenever these value changes, so it forcefully tells a component so that it should be re-rendered again, re-evaluated again. So how can we use this? Okay, so we have this active item. So instead of active item, let's make use of, okay, so let's do this. Okay, do like use state. Okay, we can define the initial state. Okay, so what it does, like use state is a hook provided by the React library. Now this is the important thing. Like use state hooks takes the initial value and returns an array. Okay, so let's take a look at what is this array. Okay, so let's log it. Active item. Let's comment it down and see. Okay, so we have this function. So I have hidden that particular thing, so it is not working as expected. Okay, so expenses, when I click on this, you can see like it returns an array with two things. Like first is the value and second is this function. So what is this function? So this function is nothing but just an updating function which helps us update this value. It's not just a it is kind of a special function which does not just updates the value, it also tells the React so that the component should be re-evaluated and re-rendered based on the latest state. Okay, so let's say if we do this and there are two indexes, right, 0 and 1, so we can make use of the array destructuring property here, right? So active item, the set active item, right? It makes sense, like this is the like value and this is a function which helps us to modify this value, right? So let's say if we directly assign the value here, the active item, that if we want to directly assign, let's see if this works. Okay, so if we click on this, still the value does not change because like we are assigning a value directly to a the state variable, so that is not feasible here, right? So we have to make use of set active item and pass the ID here, and let's see what happens. Okay. So if we see, like currently like our state is changing dynamically whenever we are passing something, whenever we are changing this variable. So we can even use the const because we are not directly, like this function is not directly assigning the value. It is like this is handled by the React somewhere in memory. So like whenever this function updates the value, it also tells the React to re-render the component. Okay, so just let me know guys, like if you have any sort of questions or am I going too fast? Okay, so this is the thing, like what we can do whenever we have to update the state. So as you can see, right, but it still does not make any sense, right? Let's say when I'm on this, the the component rendering here is fine, right? But when I click on this, it should also be changed, right? This component should also be changed. So we have three things that we can do. First, like managing the state, based on the stage we can conditionally render some components. Second, we can make use of routing. So we are going to talk about the routing in maybe upcoming sessions. So first we can do here is we can manage it using the states. Okay, so let's do it. Okay, so we have a component here, expenses, right? So let's say we want to conditionally render it. So as you know, like in JSX, we can make use of a valid JavaScript, right? So let's make use of it. So let's say we have active item, right? And if active item is 0, then we want to render these expenses, because these expenses, like in the sidebar list, we have this first item which is like whose ID is 0, and we want to render the expense list here, right? And when the ID is 1, we want to render a nice looking form maybe to add the expense. And when the ID is 2, we want to analyze some things, so which we are not going to cover, it's just for the references. Okay, so when the ID, like active item, is set to 0, I want to render these expenses. And when the active item is, let's say, 1, what I want is, I want to just display a text, maybe add expense form, and the active item is set to 2. Then we can analytics page, right? So let's see if it works or still. Yeah, it works. So let me refresh it. Okay, so now we see, whenever I click on this, we are rendering the components, even the text, conditionally, right? This is called like conditionally rendering. Okay, so my voice is low or it's just fine? Let me know. Okay, so we can see, like whenever I click on a particular list item, the relative text or component is rendering. So whenever I click on the expenses, the expense list is rendering. Whenever I click on this add expense form, the text is rendering, right? So similarly, like we can define a component and in which we have a form, right? So we can do that, right? So we have this here. So let's say we have this constant sidebar list. So if you want to refactor it a bit, what we can do is we can define you know constants in config and cut it from here and put it down here, and maybe export this particular variable so that we can use it and make use of it here. Okay, so import sidebar list from, it's in the same folder. Yeah, we can do that, right? So to keep our code a bit clean, and we are importing it directly from the constants file, because we are not changing the constants here, right? So we can see here it works just fine. Great. Okay, so that's how we can add state to our application. And this is just a state which we are toggling just to maybe render some components, conditionally render some components. Okay, so let's go back and see. So we can use any number of use state in a component, right? We can make use of, let's say we have a form with 10 fields. Okay, so we can make use of 10 use state. It is totally up to you if you want to use a single use state or multiple. That's totally up to you. Now, why do we require the states? Because states add reactivity in our application. So as we see, like when we have the normal variable, right? When we have the normal variable, the state, it was not changing, right? Because like without making use of the states, our application is just static. So to add reactivity in our application, we require that. And one more thing, so when we are updating our state here, so let's log it instantly and see the value here. Okay, if we click on this, okay, so okay, sorry, active item here. Okay, so if I click on this, you can see like the ID is 0. It is not 1, but we have updated it, right? We have updated the ID, then we are logging it, but it is not happening. Why? Because like React schedules the update. It does not, updates the value instantly, but it schedules the update. So that's like whenever React component is being re-rendered, it should be based on the latest state, not on the initial state, but on the latest state, which is set manually or programmatically. Okay. So we can remove this comment. Okay. A bit more loud. Okay. I guess the voice is audible now. Okay. Okay, so we have this thing here in place. Like whenever we are clicking on the sidebar list, then we are rendering the relative text and maybe the lists. Okay, so let's create a form and then we can make start handling the forms. How can we handle the forms? Because form handling is a very crucial part, because even if you are creating a very dumb website or anything, you must be adding some sort of form to get the information from the user. Okay, so first of all, let's comment these things. Okay, so we have this in place. Okay, so let's create a form which we can conditionally render when the active tab is add expenses. Okay, so we have these pages. Let's create another one. Expense.js. Okay. So I'm defining a functional component here at expense, which may take some props, a single value, right? And then we are returning something. We are returning, yeah. I've already defined some CSS, okay, so that we don't have to go through the CSS again and again. So we have this. Let's say we have a heading. I don't know. Let's log. If these things don't work in React, we have this form here. Okay, so form works in the similar way like in normal HTML. We have this, right? So let's define this. Okay, it may have some label, and like in HTML we have this 4 tag, right? 4 attributes. So in this we have HTML4. So to enhance the semantics and for the screen readers. So let's say we have the title here, and let's define the input field. Maybe type is text, placeholder in the title, name which is again title. Okay, so let's see, and we have to export it so that we can use it in another component. We have app.js and we can make use of it here. Okay, add expense. Okay, so let's save and see. We see, well, yeah, so it's working just fine, right? So I have created, so you can ignore the CSS if you want to, or you can look at the CSS when I push all the code in the GitHub repository, which whose link is in the description. Okay, so like we have the heading, we have the input field. Okay, so it just works the same way, like we can add anything, maybe some title. Okay, so it can be anything. So let's give it another class, so to have it in a much nicer way. Yes, form input it is. Okay, so yeah, now it's working just fine, right? So we can enter, like we have a nice looking input field here, right? So what we can do is, let's say we have multiple inputs, right? So if we want to handle the states, so let's define a state. Okay, so let's say we are using a constant, and as you know, like useState returns two values. First is the value and second is the relative function, which is basically updating function. Okay, let's say we have a title and the set title. Okay, and we are making use of useState, which is imported from the React library. Okay, so initially the string is empty, the title is empty. Okay, so let's say if we want to listen to any change in this particular input field, what we can do. So in JavaScript, we have some events, let's say on input, on change, right? So we can make use of on change, so that whenever we have, even in select, in text area, all these kind of inputs, this on change definitely would work. Okay, so on every keystroke we are getting this event. Okay, so on change we can state it here, and similarly we have to give it a function. Okay, so let's define a function. Let's name it, I don't know, input handler, I guess. Right, we are receiving the event here. Okay, and let's log this event. It's a similar way like in the document object model in the HTML JavaScript. Okay, so let's log this event and see what it does. Okay, and let's give this function as a value to this. So now if we see, we can see here minor warnings, like we have defined a title and set title, but we have not used it, right? We are going to use it in a bit. Okay, so let's add the title. And so we can see that on every keystroke, we are logging something, right? So let's check the values here. So we have this all these properties, but we are interested in this target property here. Okay, so in target we have multiple things, so we can look for the value that we have in the field. Where is this? Yeah, so we can see this is the value, right? Just a second. Yeah. So we can see whenever we are inputting something, on every keystroke we have this output, right? We have this log. Okay, so this is the thing, right? In JavaScript we have to do things step by step. Let's say we have a form, then whenever we are submitting, we grab all the fields and validate them. So in this React we can do this on the go, like we are listening to this event, right? So there is a concept of two-way binding in React. So what does it mean? So let's say we have an input field. Okay, so we are listening to the change event, but we also want give a predefined value, maybe predefined value, or whenever a form is submitted, we want to clear it out. So how can we do that? We can do it by giving it a value prop, and in that we can define the title. So initially, as you see, this is empty, right? And we are giving it a title. So if we save and see, let's see what it does. So title, but as you see, the input is not updated. Why? Because we are not actually binding it. We are just giving it a title, but we are not updating that title on the go, right? So in this event, we have this a target property, which in turn contains a value, right? So what we can do is we can set title to event.target.value, so that we are simply assigning the value to the title, right? So we can see here. So as you can see, it is kind of a two-way binding, right? Whenever we are inputting something, we are updating the value and we are passing it to the input, right? So when is this helpful? So let's see that. Okay, so let's say we have this field. Let's say we have another field, which is maybe number amount. Okay, so let's define a field for the amount. So let's define another state, which is amount. Set amount. To state initially the amount is 0. So this input handler is not generic yet, because it is specifically updating the title, right? So we have to define maybe another handler, maybe update amount handler. So set amount target value. So what we can do is amount handler and give this thing, right? And let's see. So initially, as you can see, we have given the state variable the value 0, so it is being rendered, right? So let's say if we don't give this any value, keep it empty. So it is empty, right? So we can define some predefined values, or let's say if we want to edit an expense, let's say when we are going to edit the expense, whenever the edit button is clicked, the data is being fetched. So the form should be pre-filled, right? So how can we pre-fill that? By using the two-way binding, so that we can assign the values to these input fields dynamically, right? So as you can see, like we are, whenever we click on this field, there are some predefined lists. So we can turn this off by giving this autocomplete off. So now when we click on this, there is no predefined or pre-entered inputs here anymore. Okay, and also define some buttons here. Okay, so let's define. Okay, maybe I guess flexbox. So just quickly let me copy it. Okay, so yeah. We have these two buttons, which is add expense and clear button. So let's save it. Okay, so we have this button. So the CSS, you can find it in the index.css file. Okay, so this is the CSS we have defined. So let's quickly close it. Okay, so we have these two buttons. Okay, so the ultimate task should be like whenever we enter something and whenever we submit the form. Okay, whenever we submit the form, it should be added, right? So let's say what we can do here. Okay, so instead, let's say we have entered some title, the amount here. Whenever we add the expense, you see like it is being refreshed, right? So we have to cancel this event also. So what we can do, either we can add a event listener here, but we are making use of forms. Okay, so this is the thing you can do. You can define an event listener here, which is on submit. Okay, so whenever this form is submitted, we want to catch the response and catch by catching the response, like catching this event. Okay, so let's define an event here, submit handler. Okay, on submit handler, you have the event. So first we need to cancel the event so that the page is not refreshed, right? And what we can do, we can log the title and the amount, right? So by making use of form tags, there are some special things that we can get. We can even add the browser level validation at least, right? So when I click on this, the amount and title is empty, right? But if I give it a required field, which is like, let's say I want it anyhow, right? Let's give it a required field and see. Let's say if I try to add it, so these are the browser level validations. So it is always nice to have these kind of validations. So let's say if I save, now you can see like we have the title and amount in place, right? So we can make use of this payload and process it further. So what we can do here is, let's say whenever the form is submitted, what I want is I want to show the loader, a nice looking loader, and then I want to reset this form. So how can we do that? So let's say we have a timeout. Okay, because like whenever you are storing the data into some kind of database or hitting an API, it may take certain amount of time. Okay, so first we can simulate that. Then we can set the title to its default value. Similarly, the amount to its default value programmatically. Okay, so meanwhile we can also define a variable like form processing new state to false. Okay, so whenever the form is submitted, I can set this to true, and whenever the form is processed, like the response is captured and all that stuff, whenever it is done, we can make it false. Okay, and we can put the loader here. I've already written the CSS for that. Okay, so just let me quickly copy that also. So there goes our CSS. So we can conditionally render it even, right? So like if the form processing is true, I want to show the loader. Okay, so let's see how it works now. Okay, so we have this form. Let's go to the add expense. Let's add a title, add amount, and let's say add expense. So if you see, like there was a loader for a second, then we are setting the default values of title, which is empty, and amount is empty. And then after a second, we are just processing the form. Like we are setting this variable, the form processing to false, right? So these are all the steps that we can make use of to, to implement a nice looking form. So we'll be adding few more fields here. Okay, so we see like there is a variable like for title, for amount. Okay, so like let's say we have a form which contains maybe 10-20 fields, right? So how can we handle that? Because like we can define any much of use state we want to. Like we can define 10 use states or make use of 10 use states, 20. So it's totally up to us. So what's the other way around? Okay, so let's define a variable which you can say like payload maybe, or make it much more relative to, expense data, set expense data, the updating function, and make use of used. You can define a object in there, right? So which contains a title, which contains the amount, which further contains the description, which may contain some type which is empty by default. So the type can be, credit and debit, so that, right? And maybe even a date. So it can have any number of fields, right? So let's get it. And we have this input handler, right? So first let's change these. Okay, so instead of title, what we can do here is, so we have this expense data which has a key which is title, right? In the amount we have this expense data uh, which has this value which is expense data dot amount, right? So let's save, and we also have to change the handlers. So this is the input handler, this is also input handler. So the question is, how should we update it? Okay, so let's hide this. And we want to log the expense data, and when the data is processed, then we want to set the expense data to its default values, right? Okay. So now how can we update this, right? So that should be the question, right? So whenever we get the event, we have a few more fields. If you can see, let's say we have this. Okay, so this is the event, and that's the target. So if you see, we have one more field here. Here it is, the name field, right? Whatever the name we have defined in the tag itself. Here it is. It is somewhere in there. Okay, so basically the name field is this, like whatever we have defined here, the name title, the name amount. Okay, so we can fetch it out. So we can set the expense data by this. So we have the event, which in turns like which contains the target element and the name, and we can assign the value here, target dot value. Okay, so but we also have to like keep track of all the things. Okay, so we have to get the expense data here. Okay. So this contains the previous data and the updated. It will override whatever key value we have. Okay. So let's save it and see. Okay. So set amount. On this, yeah, here. Okay. So let's see now. Okay. So let's see. We have this target, right? We have entered the title, the amount. Let's save it. So we can see like it's working as same as before, right? So we have this title, amount. Currently, we have not implemented the date description type fields, but it's there, right? Because we are updating only that particular key value pair whenever we are listening to that event. Okay, so we have this here in place. So like we can make use of these type of things, like instead of defining each and every state variable or making use of use state, we can do that, but it's totally up to you. But the efficient way should be this, right? Okay, so what's the ultimate goal like of this? So whenever we are adding the expense log, so whatever, like we want to update the list also, right? But currently the list here is also static. We want to fetch it from the server, right? So maybe in the upcoming session we are going to learn about the HTTP calls by making use of the Firebase, Firebase or Firestore, on which we are storing the data. So let's add the input fields here. Okay. Just a second here. We can add the fields. Let me quickly add a few more fields here. Okay. Okay. IKKOP. So just let me know like if you are having any issue, like if you are having any sort of difficulty here, you can clear that. Okay. So let's define a text area because the description should be of text area, right? Maybe name description. This is description, and we have to define the int handler here, right? Which is input handler. The value is like we have the expense data, right? And which contains a description field. Let me format it. Let's remove this. And we can give it a class of, I guess, text area. Okay. If we see, so we have this description field here. It is again like whenever we are writing something, it is being updated. Okay. Yeah. So it should be class name, right? Because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. That's why. Okay. Okay. So what was expense? Okay, so basically, which variable you are talking about, like which expense thing you are talking about? Expense is basically like whatever we are, spending some amount or getting some amount. So that's is expense. Okay, so we can define a placeholder here. Enter description. So we have these fields. We can add few more fields here. Okay, so let's say we have this amount negative. So we can even do that by giving it a max of even minimum of 0, I guess, so that it won't go to negative thing, right? So it's not going to negative thing if I click on the decrement thing. Okay, so we can add these fields, and whenever we are submitting, okay, so I want to send the data to its parent. So in the similar way, we have defined the functions for the sidebar thing. We can do that here also. Okay, so we have this thing. Okay, so in app.js, let's create a function from, let's say, add expense submission. And so we are receiving the payload here. Okay, so let's log the payload for now. Okay. So we have these props. So in these props, we are receiving this handler. Okay, so let's define the handler here. Submit handler. Okay. On submit handler. So whenever this function is called, it will be logged here, right? So let's define it here. So after a second, I want to call this function, which is in the props. You can destructure it. Okay. So whenever you are doing this thing, you want to send the data, right? You want to send the data before the states update, right? So let's save it and see. Okay, so we have the title here, we have the description, we have the amount. Okay, so let's save it and see. The data is, sent to the app.js file. We can see that here, like app.js.20, right? So it is logged from here. So what we can do is, okay, so let's study about our project a bit. Okay, so we have added the states. So like whenever I click on any button, my state is changing, so does my components based on that state. So our ultimate goal is, whenever I add an expense, it should be added in this button. And whenever I click on the delete button, or delete, maybe a alert should open. So whether a confirmation modal basically, so that whether I be able to delete this particular expense item or not, right? Whenever I click on this edit button, like it should redirect me to the add expense page with the data pre-filled so that I can edit the data, right? So these are the few things that we can implement. So you can add a delete handler here, and so I'll be pushing the complete code. Okay, so you can go through the code by yourself and study it a bit. Try to implement few functionality. Try to implement, let's say, this delete functionality. Let's say we have the list right here, right? In expenses, in this component, we have this list, right? So whenever I click on this button, in expense item, we have these buttons, right? So we can add a functionality. Let's say we can add one delete handler. We can define a delete handler, edit handler. So you can define those handlers as your homework if you want to. Okay, so in the upcoming session, we are going to interact with the Firebase and make use of, like, store some things from the database and fetch from it. Okay, so next session, we are going to talk about the HTTP calls and a bit about another hook, which is use effect, which is also a very crucial hook. Okay, so if you guys have any sort of questions, we can have it now. Okay. Okay, so should I join TCS or any startup for learning? So learning is not about, like, you can learn without even joining the company. So it's totally up to you. Okay, Nitish, you got a job in Angular 8 from, okay, learn React. So you can learn it side by side along with your main job description. So that, because learning never stops, you should learn about newer technologies, because web development is ever changing and it is changing on the go. So it's totally up to you. You can start it at any point in time, and even now, it's totally up to you. Okay. So I guess, like, in this particular session, we have studied about the rendering, conditional rendering, about forms, how we can define some two-way binding and form elements. How can we bind the field with the state elements, state variables, and we have differentiated between a normal variable and by making use of the state variable, right? And we have learned about some event handling also here, right? So I guess this session was productive for you guys. Okay. Okay. So I guess that is all for this session. Different ways how child communicates with. Okay, so that is a nice question. Different ways. So first way is, like, whenever we can, like, from parent to child, if you want to communicate, you can send the props, and if you want to do it like other way around, from child to parent, you can send some functions, like a child invokes, execute those functions, so that we can do some processing in the parent component. Okay, that is the first way. Second way is, like, let's say if you have maybe 10-20 components in a hierarchy, you can make use of context API, which is not in the scope, but you can definitely look for that, the context API, or you can even use the central management system, the central management, which is by making use of Redux. So that is all the things that you can do to communicate between parent and child. Okay, so the Redux part and the context API is not in the scope of this project in this course even. Okay, so you can look for it on the official documentation and Google it. Okay, so I guess that is all for this session, guys, and hope this session is productive for you. So stay safe. Okay, bye.